There is a difference between thoughts that illuminate and thoughts that obscure. The first are like sunlight streaming through windows. The second are like heavy clouds that block the sky. Negative thoughts are not merely unwelcome visitors. They are persistent residents who seem to have claimed permanent residence in the mind. They whisper stories of inadequacy, paint futures filled with failure, and replay past mistakes with cruel precision. Unlike their intrusive cousins who arrive uninvited, negative thoughts often feel like our own voice speaking our deepest fears as if they were facts. An ancient truth emerges. The mind is like weather, constantly changing, yet we often mistake the current storm for the permanent climate. The question is not how to control the weather, but how to find shelter and remember that every storm passes. The weatherman's burden. A weatherman lived in a town where he was responsible for predicting each day's conditions. He took his work seriously, studying patterns, analyzing data, and doing his best to help people prepare. But over time, he began to notice something troubling. Every prediction he made seemed to skew toward catastrophe. Where he once saw partly cloudy, he now saw impending storm. Where he once predicted light showers, he now forecast devastating floods. His forecasts grew darker and more dire with each passing day. The townspeople began to live in constant fear, carrying umbrellas in bright sunshine and boarding up windows at the first sign of a breeze. One day, an old meteorologist visited the town. Hearing the weatherman's latest forecast of doom, he asked to see the data. After careful review, he looked puzzled. "Your instruments are working perfectly," he said. "Your data is accurate, but you're reading storm clouds into every formation. You've forgotten that clouds are temporary, that most weather patterns pass without disaster, and that the sky is vast enough to hold both storms and sunshine." The weatherman had become so focused on protecting people from potential harm that he had forgotten to see the beauty in ordinary weather. He had trained his mind to see threats in every cloud formation. With gentle guidance, he learned to read the data without adding the commentary of catastrophe. He discovered that most days were simply days. Some brought rain, some brought sun, but few brought the disasters his worried mind had imagined. Teaching. Negative thoughts often arise from a mind trained to see danger in ordinary circumstances. The practice is learning to distinguish between actual data and the stories we tell ourselves about that data. The Garden of Thorns. A gardener inherited a plot of land that had been neglected for years. The soil was rich and fertile, but it was overrun with thorny weeds that seemed to grow faster than anything else. Every morning, she would venture out with her tools, determined to clear the weeds and plant something beautiful. But the thorns were persistent. For every one she removed, two more seemed to appear. The harder she worked, the more frustrated she became. "I am a terrible gardener," she would think. "I will never create anything beautiful here. This land is cursed and I am not skilled enough to change it." These thoughts grew like weeds themselves, spreading through her mind until she could barely see the rich soil beneath the thorns. She began to believe that she was fundamentally incapable of creating beauty. An experienced gardener, walking by one day, noticed her struggle. "What are you fighting?" she asked. "These terrible weeds," the woman replied. "They prove I'm not meant to be a gardener. I'm just not good enough." The older woman smiled knowingly. "Child, do you see how rich this soil is? Do you notice how vigorously things grow here? This land doesn't grow weeds because it's cursed. It grows weeds because it's fertile. The same soil that grows thorns can grow roses." She taught the young gardener a different approach. Instead of fighting the weeds, she could plant what she wanted to grow and tend to those plants with consistent care. The weeds would still appear, but they would have to compete with the intentionally planted flowers for nutrients and space. Over time, the garden transformed, not because the weeds stopped growing, but because the gardener learned to cultivate what she valued more than she fought what she didn't want. Teaching. Negative thoughts often grow in fertile minds capable of deep feeling and rich imagination. The practice is not to eliminate this fertility, but to plant what we want to grow and tend to it with consistent care. The mirror maker's distortion. A mirror maker had crafted beautiful, clear mirrors for years. His reflections were true and helped people see themselves clearly. But gradually, his mirrors began to show distortions. At first, the distortions were subtle, a slight narrowing here, a dark shadow there. But over time they became more pronounced. Every mirror he made seemed to reflect back exaggerated flaws, imagined imperfections, and distorted proportions. The mirror maker was puzzled. His technique hadn't changed. His materials were the same, and his tools were properly maintained. Yet every reflection seemed to emphasize the worst aspects of whoever looked into it. He began to question his own reflection. When he looked in his own mirrors, he saw failure, inadequacy, and a craftsman who had lost his touch. The distortions seemed to confirm his worst fears about himself. One day, a master glassworker visited his shop. After examining several mirrors, she made a surprising observation. Your technical skill is flawless. The distortions aren't in the mirrors, they're in your expectations of what the mirrors should show. She helped him understand that he had begun looking for flaws so intently that he had unconsciously begun crafting mirrors that emphasized them. His worry about imperfection had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The master taught him to return to his original intention, creating mirrors that showed truth, not flaws. When he focused on clarity rather than perfection, on truth rather than criticism, his mirrors began to reflect beauty as well as imperfection, strength as well as weakness. Teaching. Negative thoughts often arise when we focus so intently on flaws that we lose sight of the whole picture. The practice is returning to the intention of seeing truth rather than seeking confirmation of our worst fears. If this message resonates with you, and you're seeking more moments of peace and insight, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for daily reflections rooted in ancient wisdom and modern clarity. The Storyteller's Trap. A storyteller lived in a village where people gathered each evening to hear tales of adventure, wisdom, and wonder. For years, she had filled their imaginations with stories of heroes overcoming challenges and finding happiness. But gradually, her stories began to change. The heroes became tragic figures doomed to failure. The adventures became cautionary tales of inevitable loss. The wisdom became warnings about the futility of hope. The villagers, once eager to hear her tales, began to avoid the evening gatherings. The storyteller noticed their absence and concluded that she had lost her gift, that her stories were no longer worth telling. This belief became its own story, a tale of a storyteller who had once been gifted but was now worthless. She told this story to herself so often that it felt more real than any tale she had ever shared with others. An old bard traveling through the village heard about the storyteller's plight. He asked to hear one of her stories, and she reluctantly told him the tale of her own downfall. The bard listened carefully, then smiled. "You are still a masterful storyteller," he said. "Your technique is flawless, your imagery is vivid, and your emotional impact is powerful. The only problem is that you've chosen to tell the same tragic story over and over, the story of your own failure." He helped her see that she had become trapped in a single narrative, one that cast her as the protagonist of a tragedy. But she had the power to choose different stories, to remember the comedies and adventures that were also part of her life. The storyteller learned to notice when she was telling herself the story of failure, and to consciously choose other stories that were equally true, stories of growth, learning, and the natural cycles of creativity. Teaching. Negative thoughts often trap us in repetitive stories about ourselves. The practice is recognizing when we're telling ourselves the same tragic tale and consciously choosing to remember other stories that are equally true. The weightlifter's burden. A weightlifter trained diligently every day, always pushing himself to lift heavier loads. He found meaning in the challenge and took pride in his growing strength. But over time, he began to notice something troubling. The weights he could lift seemed to grow lighter in his mind, while the weights he couldn't lift seemed to grow heavier. His achievements felt insignificant, while his limitations felt overwhelming. He began to focus entirely on what he couldn't do. The weight he couldn't lift became a symbol of his inadequacy. The goals he hadn't reached became evidence of his failure. The progress he had made seemed to disappear in the shadow of his remaining weaknesses. Other gym members would compliment his strength, but he could only see how much stronger others were. Trainers would praise his progress, but he could only focus on how far he had yet to go. One day, an old trainer noticed his distress. "What weight are you trying to lift?" he asked. "I can't lift what I used to." "Dream of lifting," the man replied. "I'm not as strong as I thought I would be." The trainer nodded thoughtfully. "You're trying to lift the weight of your expectations, the weight of comparison, the weight of perfectionism. These are not physical weights, they're mental ones, and they're much heavier than any barbell." He taught the weightlifter to notice when he was adding these invisible weights to his actual training. When he focused only on the physical weight in front of him, without the added burden of judgment and comparison, he found that he was actually quite strong. Teaching. Negative thoughts often add invisible weight to our actual challenges. The practice is learning to distinguish between the real load we're carrying and the mental weight we add through judgment and comparison. The compass reader's confusion. There was once a seasoned navigator, renowned for her ability to guide others through vast, unfamiliar territories. She had spent years mastering the subtle art of orientation, learning to read the stars, interpret cloud patterns, and most of all, to trust the compass she carried close to her heart. That small, steady needle had pointed the way through storms, over treacherous waters, and into safe harbors. Her guidance had saved many from wandering aimlessly or losing hope in dark times. But something began to change. At first it was subtle, a slight hesitation before choosing a route, a flicker of doubt as she stared at the needle. "North," it said, but something in her chest whispered otherwise. Over time, the dissonance grew louder. Every direction her compass pointed seemed to promise disaster. What once felt like intuition now felt like guesswork. Once familiar paths seemed foreign, dangerous, uncertain. She began to question the compass itself. "Maybe it's broken," she thought. "Maybe it's always been broken. Maybe I've been misguiding people all along." She recalled the journeys she'd led with pride, but now even those memories became tinted with suspicion. Perhaps she had just been lucky. Perhaps she didn't really have what it took to guide herself, let alone anyone else. These thoughts didn't come all at once. They crept in slowly, like fog rolling over a coastline, obscuring what was once clear. The more she doubted, the more her sense of direction seemed to deteriorate. The needle on her compass began to spin, no longer resting on a steady north. Panic set in. She tried harder to force clarity, gripping the compass, recalibrating it again and again, but the more she strained, the more lost she felt. Her self-trust, once the anchor of her every decision, unraveled. Eventually, in quiet desperation, she sought out an old mentor, an experienced navigator who had weathered many storms of his own. He listened carefully, watching as she explained her struggles, the erratic compass, the fear that she was no longer the person she once was. Gently he asked to see the instrument. After some time examining it, he looked up with calm certainty. "Your compass," he said, "is perfectly functional. It was never broken." Confused, she stared at him. "Then why—" He tapped her chest lightly. "You're carrying something that's interfering with its readings." She was puzzled. "But I have nothing with me. No magnets, no metal." "Not in your hands," he replied, "but in your mind." He explained that just as a magnetic field can distort the accuracy of a real compass, emotional burdens can warp our internal sense of direction. Fear, unprocessed pain, old guilt, and persistent self-doubt. These were the invisible weights she had unknowingly gathered. They clung to her like iron filings, skewing the needle's truth, distorting clarity with noise. Together, they began to unpack those burdens, one by one. She named the fear of failure, the shame of imperfection, the belief that her worth was tied to always being right. As each one was brought into the light of awareness, its magnetic pull lessened. The static began to fade. In a moment of stillness, she looked down and saw the needle settle again, pointing unwaveringly toward north. Tears welled in her eyes, not because the compass worked, but because she realized she had always known how to navigate. Her instincts, her wisdom, her capacity to find the way forward had never left her. They had simply been drowned out by the noise of her own mind. And so she walked on, not with absolute certainty, but with quiet trust. She no longer sought perfection in her readings, nor feared temporary confusion. She understood that sometimes the compass wavers not because we are broken, but because we are burdened. And when we learn to pause, release, and listen with clarity, the direction we seek becomes visible again. Not because it appeared, but because it was always there, teaching. Negative thoughts often interfere with our natural abilities like magnetic fields around a compass. The practice is learning to identify and temporarily set aside the mental interference so we can access our inherent wisdom. The Echo Chambers Lesson. There once lived a gifted musician who made her home in a grand concert hall renowned for its flawless acoustics. The hall was her sanctuary, a place where sound came alive, where each note she played danced through the air and returned to her in perfect harmony. She had spent years tuning her instrument, refining her technique, and learning to express the deepest parts of her soul through music. Every day she would sit in the center of the hall and let melodies pour from her fingertips. The walls responded with warmth and grace, sending her music back in waves of rich resonance. Her compositions soared, full of joy, sorrow, triumph, and tenderness. She came to trust the space around her as a partner in creation, a sacred mirror that reflected her inner world through sound. But then one quiet morning she struck a wrong note. It wasn't intentional, just a moment of lapse, an accidental slip of the hand. The note rang out, sharp and jarring, unlike anything she had ever intended to play. Startled, she paused, and instead of moving on, she froze. What was that? Why did it happen? How could she have missed it? Curious and unsettled, she played the note again. Then again. She dissected it, slowed it down, obsessed over it. She played it louder, then softer, then held it longer to listen for its source. But each time she struck the key, the acoustics, so faithful, so responsive, magnified it, echoing the sound back with stunning clarity. Soon, the once harmonious hall was overwhelmed by the repetition of that single discordant note. It bounced from wall to wall, layered upon itself, until it became a storm of noise. The echoes began to blend and distort, feeding back on each other, turning one mistake into a chorus of cacophony. The musician covered her ears. She could no longer hear the original beauty of the space. She could no longer hear herself. And then the thoughts came. Maybe I'm not a good musician after all. Maybe this hall is broken, cursed. Maybe I was never really talented, just lucky, just fooling myself. She stopped playing altogether, paralyzed by the sound of her own perceived failure. The silence she once found sacred now felt haunted. Her sanctuary had become a prison. One day, an elder musician, a master known not just for his skill but for his wisdom, visited the hall. Hearing the overwhelming discord, he entered and found her curled up near the stage, her instrument beside her, untouched. She told him everything: the note, the echoes, the growing belief that she was no longer fit to play. She expected critique. Instead, he sat beside her and listened with compassion. Finally, he spoke. "You have forgotten the nature of echoes." She looked up, puzzled. "The hall is not punishing you," he said. "It is simply doing what it was built to do. Reflect whatever you give it. When you played beautiful music, it echoed beauty. When you repeated the mistake, it echoed that too." He paused, then added gently, "You're not trapped by the note you played. You're trapped by your focus on it." He stood, picked up her instrument, and played a soft, simple melody, just a few notes of grace and ease. The hall responded instantly, catching the sound and returning it in soft waves of beauty. "See," he smiled, "you can begin again, at any moment." Something shifted inside her. For the first time in what felt like ages, she touched her instrument not to analyze or fix, but to feel. She played a single note, pure and intentional. It rang out and returned, not alone, but surrounded by silence, peace, and possibility. Then another note, and another. And slowly, the old discord began to fade beneath the weight of something new. She realized something profound. Her mind was just like the concert hall, It amplified whatever she chose to focus on. If she filled it with mistakes, fear, and self-criticism, it would echo those endlessly, making them feel inescapable. But if she chose to offer it, gentleness, courage, and renewal, even imperfectly, it would return those too, magnified and enriched. From that day forward, she no longer feared wrong notes. She understood that mistakes were part of the music, not the end of it. She learned to pause, to breathe, to shift focus from judgment to creation. And in doing so, she discovered the most powerful melody she had ever played, the sound of self-forgiveness, resonating in a hall designed to echo every truth she was finally ready to hear. Teaching. Negative thoughts often echo and amplify in the chambers of our mind. The practice is choosing to play new notes, thoughts of compassion, growth, and possibility, and letting the natural acoustics of our consciousness amplify these instead. The integration. Finding light in the darkness. These stories weave together a deeper understanding. Negative thoughts are not enemies to be defeated, but patterns to be understood and transformed. They arise from minds capable of deep feeling, rich imagination, and intense caring. They reflect our values turned inward, our love expressed as worry, our hope shadowed by fear. The journey through negative thoughts contains several key elements. Recognition. Understanding that negative thoughts are often distortions of our caring, not reflections of reality. Perspective. Learning to see thoughts as mental weather, temporary conditions in the vast sky of awareness. Choice. Recognizing that we have the power to choose which thoughts to feed with our attention. Compassion. Treating ourselves with the same kindness we would offer a friend struggling with similar thoughts. Action. Engaging in activities that align with our values, even when negative thoughts suggest we shouldn't. Patience. Understanding that changing thought patterns takes time and consistent practice. The path through negative thoughts is not about achieving perpetual positivity, but about developing a wise relationship with all the weather of the mind. We learn to find shelter in the storms, to remember that clouds are temporary, and to trust that the sun still shines above even the darkest weather. A practice for the path. If you seek to walk this path of transformation, begin gently. Morning intention. Each day, set an intention to notice when negative thoughts arise and to treat them as weather rather than facts. Thought. Labeling. When you notice negative thinking patterns, simply note worrying, criticizing, or catastrophizing, and return to your present activity. Truth testing. Ask yourself, is this thought helpful? Is it true? Is it the whole truth? Often, negative thoughts contain a grain of truth, wrapped in distortion. Value alignment. When negative thoughts arise, ask, what do I care about that this thought is trying to protect? Then take an action aligned with that value. Compassionate friend. Speak to yourself as you would to a dear friend facing the same struggle. What would you say to them? Professional support. If negative thoughts significantly impact your daily life, consider working with a therapist trained in cognitive behavioral therapy or other evidence-based approaches. The light that remains. Moving through the terrain of negative thoughts is not about erasing the darkness, but learning how to walk with a lantern in hand. We do not command the winds, nor do we part the clouds on demand. But we can choose to be a steady flame amidst the storm, a quiet light that does not waver, even when the sky roars. Thoughts, like weather, come and go. Some days bring sunlight, others rain. But no storm, no matter how fierce, can touch the vastness of the sky. The sky does not resist the clouds. It holds them. The sun does not fight to be seen, it waits, knowing it has never stopped shining. And in the same way, your awareness, the deeper part of you, remains untouched by the passing moods of the mind. You are not the turbulence. You are not the lightning. You are the open space in which all of it unfolds. The fear, the doubt, the waves of criticism, they are just weather systems passing through. They are not who you are. When darkness settles in, remember, it is not a failure. It is a season, and every season changes. When your thoughts grow heavy, do not believe you are broken. You are simply beneath a cloud. The sky is still there. You are still here. And nothing can dim the light that has always lived within you. Let go of the need to be perfect. Let go of the urge to fix everything immediately. Instead, breathe. Be still. Notice the storm, but anchor yourself in the awareness that watches it pass. You do not need to chase the light. You are the light. Not because you never struggle, but because even in your struggle something luminous endures. The clouds will part. The dawn will come. And when it does, you will see you were never lost. You were never alone. You were simply weathering a moment in time. May you walk forward with kindness. May you remember your vastness. And may you know, in every moment of shadow, that the sky within you remains clear, open, and free.